Now, if you're new to my channel, I'm going to let you know one thing right off the top. And it's that I'm going to keep it as real as possible when telling you what it takes to buy some real estate or to buy a property. Now, I know all over the internet, you've probably seen things about how you can buy property with little to no money down or using other people's money, blah, blah, blah. Well, in reality, that's really not the case. Now, if you want to know exactly how much money you need to save up if you're planning on buying real estate, whether it's your first investment property or your first home, stick with me and I'll break down the numbers for you. If you're a first-time home buyer or a first-time real estate investor, exactly how much money do you need to save to buy your first house? Well, for those of you in a rush, let me make it simple for you. You need to save 6.5% of the purchase price of whatever home you want in order to buy a home. Simple as that. So for example, if you're looking to buy a $300,000 home, you need to save 6.5% of that $300,000, which is $19,500. 6.5%? Why exactly is that the magic number that I need in order to close on a home? Well, stick around and I'll break down that number and show you exactly what goes into the amount of money that you need in order to buy a home. And also stick around to the end and I'll break down the myth of getting the seller to pay for your closing costs, because I know that's what a lot of you are thinking. Maybe I can just get around this number by getting the seller to pay everything, but that's not always the case. All right, so let's break down exactly what goes into the amount of money you need to bring to the closing table in order to purchase your first property. The first part is the down payment. Now, a down payment is basically the amount of money you bring out of your own pocket in order to purchase a home. Most lenders, well, pretty much all lenders will require that you bring some of your own money to the table when purchasing a home. Ever wonder why? Lenders want to see buyers put up some of their own money when purchasing a home because they believe it reduces the risk of the buyers defaulting on that loan. Basically, lenders believe that if you're putting up some of your own money, you're less likely to flake out on the loan and stop paying it when things get tough. At the end of the day, you're less likely to just let an investment go if you have tens of thousands of dollars of your own money invested in it, and in this case, the investment would be your house or the real estate property. Lenders require that you have a down payment of 3.5% of the purchase price if you're using an FHA loan, and for conventional loans, it can vary. I've seen conventional loans require a down payment as low as 3%, and I've seen some with 5%, and with investment properties, I've seen them go as high as 20%. But for general purposes, you're going to need at least a 3.5% down payment. The second part of the money that you need to have in order to buy a home is called the closing costs. Closing costs are basically just fees that the lenders charge in order to process and actually go through with your loan. Closing costs can include a lot of pieces that you may not think about, such as the application fees for your loan, the underwriting fees, the amount of money that they have to hold in escrow because they like to keep some money in reserve for your property taxes, just stuff like that. While a lot of buyers are aware that you need to save up money for a down payment, they aren't aware that on top of that down payment, you also need to save up additional money for these closing costs. Closing costs can generally average around 3% of the purchase price. So if you take the 3% you will need for the closing costs and add on the 3.5% that you need to save for the down payment, that's where I get the 6.5%. All right, so now that I've gone over the amount of money that you need to save in order to buy your first property, as a buyer, I believe I know what's on your minds right now. I know that most buyers today are pretty savvy, and with the availability of all the information that's on the internet, you've probably run across something that says, hey, you don't need to save up all of this money in order to buy your first home because you can have the seller pay your closing costs. This is actually true in theory. Most lenders will allow a seller to pay up to 6% of the purchase price and closing costs, which would cover most, if not all, of the money that you would need to bring in order to close. But just because it makes sense in theory doesn't mean that that actually happens in reality. So on one hand, most sellers really don't mind paying your closing costs as long as they get the amount of money they are looking for. On the other hand, if you come to a seller and pretty much ask them to pay all of your closing costs, they're going to start looking at your deal as risky and start to think that maybe you don't have the money necessary in order to buy this home. Sellers actually think the same way that lenders think, And remember how lenders generally want you to put forth some of your own money because it makes you less risky and less likely to back out of the deal? Sellers think the same thing. They think that if you need them to put forth all this money for closing costs, that you don't really have that money and you're more likely to back out of the deal because if any little thing goes wrong, you can't really afford to counteract that because you don't have any money. It's the seller that's going to have to pay forth all of that money. Here's a quick example of how asking the seller to pay for closing costs can go wrong for you as a buyer. Let's say you run across a home for $300,000. You really like the home, so you want to offer $300,000 to the seller, but you want the seller to pay $15,000 in your closing costs so you don't have to bring that much money to closing. In order to do that, you offer the seller $315,000. That way the seller will be able to net the $300,000 they're looking for, and they'll pay you $15,000 in closing costs. Sounds like a win-win, right? Well, everything's going good until you get to the appraisal, and the appraisal of the home doesn't come in at $315,000. The home only appraises at $300,000. So because of this, now the bank is only willing to give out $300,000 and not $315K, which means that the seller can no longer give you that $15,000 in closing costs. So this means that this deal is going to fall apart unless you as a buyer can come up with that cash needed for closing. And if you don't, not only do you lose out on this home, but you also lose out on the money that you paid for the appraisal and most likely the money that you paid doing an inspection on the home. Bottom line is this: as a buyer, you should have enough money to saved up to be able to close on the home without having to rely on the seller to pay closing costs. The more closing costs you ask the seller to pay, the riskier the deal becomes. And you need to be able to cover that money just in case for whatever reason the seller isn't going to be able to give you that money for closing. Alright guys, that's a quick video explaining how much money you need to save if you're looking to buy a home for the first time. Any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to me. And of course, if you're looking to buy or sell real estate in the Chicagoland area, you know who to turn to.